I've had a lot of weird encounters outside of my office on smoke breaks, but I think this one takes the cake, even with how anticlimactic it was. Today I was sitting on the wall outside my building smoking and messing around on my phone. I'd probably been sitting there for about 2 minutes without looking up. When I finally do, I notice a guy on the corner about 20 feet away staring at me. He's hunched over facing me in the classic zombie pose, wearing a large coat, a surgical mask, and gloves. I didn't know how long he'd been standing there, but it was daytime, and the area is relatively populated, so despite being the only people on the street, I wasn't too worried. I went back to looking on my phone, but kept discreetly glancing in his direction to see if he was still there. He didn't move or stop looking at me for probably another minute and a half. Just sunken shoulders, with his unblinking eyes pointed directly at me over that mask. Finally, I notice an older man walking towards us, and my cigarette is almost finished, so I assume worst comes to worst, this guy will be near if anything happens. I glance back at my phone and hear what I assume are the older man's footsteps approaching. Before I have a chance to look up, the surgical zombie is sitting within an inch of me on the wall. I'm a polite girl, so I give him a vague smile while my inner self and personal space are screaming at me to get up and leave. He asks me for a cigarette, so I give him one and he just continues sitting there with it unlit. I can't fight my manners, so I ask him if he needs a light, and he gives me a gloved thumbs up and stares at me. I ask him if that meant he had one, to which he responds with another double thumbs up. I assume that was him saying he did so I turn back to my phone, planning on taking one more drag before getting up to leave. He then says, "Yes, I need one." So I give him my lighter. He hands it back and I put my smoke out and stand up. He then begins laughing, like full belly laughing. I didn't really know how to respond, so I told him to have a nice day and I walked out of the building. To be honest, I've never really had a fear of people, and I can't say this is the first time I've had someone that has done something like this, but the mask and gloves really added to the absurdity of the situation. It's Friday night at around 8:45 p.m. The little one's in bed, and I'm chilling with some friends online gaming. There's a loud bang, and I'm instantly freaking out due to having my home, my safe place, invaded by some creeper twice in the past 3 months. I turn the volume on my computer down, trying my best to come up with an excuse. Oh, it was the neighbors doing something. Who in their right minds would try to break into my house when they can see that I'm awake? Front outdoor light on, lounge light on. It's quiet for a while, so I return to playing the game and talking to my friends. That's when I hear rustling. I think it's coming from the game, despite the volume being super low. But to be on the safe side, I turn the sound of the computer off completely. The rustling is still there. At this point, I think it might be that annoying pest possum. The banging could have been it jumping onto the garage roof, and it was now snuffling around outside the leaves, searching for some food. As I said earlier, who would try and trespass when they could clearly see someone was home? If they did trespass, why would they be doing so loudly? I want to say it to put me at ease, but it didn't. Fast forward half an hour, and the noises have stopped. My cat's begging me to be let outside. Little bastard. I love him, really. I hate opening doors, curtains, or windows at night. Paranoia at its finest. But tonight, I had a reason to be paranoid at least. I kept the chain lock on the door and let the fat fuzzball squeeze his ass out, and I had a bit of a peek through the crack, seeing if anything was amiss out on my front yard. Nothing out of the ordinary, so I lock the door and head back to the lounge. 5 minutes later, someone tries the door handle. Finding it locked, I hear a laugh, and they start scratching on the glass as I frantically grab my phone and call the police. Whoever it was had left by the time they answered the phone, and the police couldn't find evidence that anyone had been on the property. They did a sweep of the neighborhood, but couldn't find anyone on the streets either. Whoever you are, I'd say let's not meet, but I'm pretty sure you're the same person who came the other 2 times, and I'm fairly certain that this person is my ex. So, Mr. X, if it is you, smile for the cameras next time you come around. They just arrived in my mailbox. This past weekend, my soon-to-be wife Alexia and I had just settled down for a night of movies, pizza, and cuddling. We live in a residential area right outside of town. Our home's situated right across the street from a Presbyterian church with a large cemetery behind it. Most of our neighbors don't own pets, but there's one in particular across the street and downwards a bit who owns perhaps the loudest, most annoying dog to ever exist. Quite an annoyance on a night like tonight, but luckily it was quiet for the entire evening. It's around after 10 p.m., and we're lying down watching a film in our living room when the loudest dog on earth begins to go off. Unfortunately, there's nothing much we can do, except maybe confront our neighbor or file a noise complaint, but who wants to be the neighbor that does that shit? After about 5 minutes, I get up off the couch and decide to walk over to my neighbor's home, say something about the dog. As I headed outside and made my way to their driveway, unfortunately, I noticed that the neighbor wasn't home. Their only car was not there. I decided anyway to walk up to the door and ring the bell. After a minute of no one answering, I gave up and headed back towards home. I noticed that Alexia had stepped outside and was looking on towards the direction of the barking. I told her that no one was home and that we should either ignore it or file another complaint. No one should have to deal with a loud dog at night, especially if you're trying to unwind after a long day of work or are trying to sleep. Alexia and I head back inside for a bit. Finally, after about 10 minutes, the dog ceases to bark. Alexia and I exhaled and laughed a bit before continuing our film. But of course, not long after that, the dog starts up again. This time sounds vicious. I got up, went outside, and approached our neighbor's fenced-off backyard. Saw the dog. Must have heard or saw me coming. It stopped barking, walked up to me, and began to pant in the cute way that dogs do. I chuckled and said the dog's name, to which he looked at me and sat next to me. Such a good animal, even if it's so loud. I then heard something that sounded like somebody walking through leaves coming from behind me and to the right. I turn around to see somebody looking at me from behind a gravestone in the cemetery. The dog must have heard this as well, as it sprung up and began to bark in the direction of the headstone. I looked on as a person continued staring in my direction, and as the dog continued to bark. I looked towards my house where I saw Alexia standing near her car, looking at me with a confused look on her face. I looked in horror as I saw the person reveal himself from behind the gravestone. His forehead and cheek were stained red with blood, dripping down off of his chin. In his hand was some sort of dagger. The dog began to go ballistic as the person took a few steps in our direction, before stopping. I turned to the dog and then back at my home. Alexia, who was still outside, yelled out to me what was wrong. I told her to call the police. She said, "Why, the dog?" To which I replied, "He's fucking armed." Probably confused, Alexia went into the house to her phone as I continued to watch on as a person began to back off, the dog now going berserk. It was going to take a bit of time for someone to reach our home, so I readied myself to go into self-defense as I watched the man finally turn around and walk away towards the back of the cemetery, and then the woods. When the police finally arrived, the person was long gone, and I was stuck there explaining to a couple of skeptical officers about my encounter. They didn't seem to take me that seriously, but still investigated the area as I explained to Alexia about the person I saw. When the police left after finding no trace of anyone, Alexia and I didn't feel much better. We locked our doors and windows, and I decided to call our neighbors to fill them in on everything before heading back to continue our movie night in spectacular fashion with The Exorcist. When I was 19, I worked for a company that allocated labor to rural areas of Australia. Basically, what you did was tell them when you were available, and they'd send you to a remote farm for a few weeks where you'd do whatever they needed done. It was hard work and long hours, but good pay and good fun if you got in with a nice group of workers. When this occurred, I was working on a large property. It was in the middle of nowhere. I was working at the farm clearing bushland with 3 other guys my age from the city, and our boss was called a guy named Jeremy, who owned the farm and was supervising us while helping out with work. He was pretty laid back and was generally good to us. This summer in particular was very hot, and the work was so hard. One day when the temperature hit about 38 degrees Celsius, which is about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, Jeremy decided to give us the afternoon off. He said he knew of a water hole on a farm about a 25-minute drive north. I was keen for a swim, but the other guys just wanted to relax for the Arvo. So him and I hopped in one of the work trucks and started heading across the property. It was mostly wide open, empty expanses with a few clumps of scattered bushland. Jeremy wasn't much of a talker, so we drove more or less in silence. After about 20 minutes, however, he suddenly perked up and jabbed me in the ribs. He said, "Do you see that over there? Beneath the 2 dead trees." I should mention here that if you're not familiar with inland areas, particularly those in Australia, they are brown or red, and mostly flat bland, meaning any bright colors stick out like a sore thumb. So you can imagine our surprise when we could see a large blue angular structure far off in the distance. We steered in its direction, and as we got closer we realized it was a huge blue shipping container, just sitting in the middle of nowhere. Jeremy was perplexed. I asked him if he knew what it was, but he obviously did not. He said he hadn't seen it when he drove through the same area 5 weeks earlier, and he wanted to go and see what it was. Initially, we pulled to a stop about 100 meters away from it. At this stage, I had a really bad feeling. The whole thing wasn't right. It's hard to explain, but if you can imagine seeing such a foreign object in the middle of a huge barren expanse, it had to be something weird. Jeremy, however, wanted to investigate, which I understood, given it was his property, but in truth I was terribly anxious. As we got closer, things got even more bizarre. There was a large diesel generator behind it thumping away, and a CCTV camera on each side, all motion activated so they buzzed from side to side, following us as we moved around. I tried to reason with Jeremy, something along the lines of, "With all this security, someone obviously doesn't want us here. Let's just go." He brushed me off, however, reminding me it was his farm, and whoever had put it there was trespassing, so we wanted to go inside. Despite all the surveillance, there was only a small padlock on the huge door. We had some bolt cutters in his toolbox, and after a bit of a struggle, we broke the lock and went inside. The first thing I noticed was a rush of cold air. There were flashing LEDs all around the place, and a sort of hum you would hear when a hard drive is working hard. When we finally switched on the lights, we could see a sophisticated, albeit somewhat cluttered office set up. There were hard drives the size of bar fridges, and other computer equipment lining the walls, sometimes piled 2 or 3, and plastic storage boxes scattered around the far wall, with several desks with computer monitors arranged in the middle, complete with rolling office chairs. At this stage, I felt like I was in one of those nonsensical dreams. My heart was racing and I just wanted to bolt. We had been We had been seen by the CCTV, so if anyone was monitoring, they already knew we were here. Jeremy, on the other hand, was adamant that we had to get to the bottom of this, so I put on a brave face and started looking through the computer. This went on for a while, but in short, neither of us had a very high grasp of technology outside of Facebook and Microsoft Word. The best I can describe it from the lay position is that it was endless lists of computer talk. It was like the old Napster or LimeWire download screens looked alike, just constantly picking up and receiving data, then recording it on several windows. I gave up on the computers and walked cautiously over to the far end of the container, to the big pile of storage boxes. By then I was pretty sure no one else was there, as there was nowhere to hide really, but I was still incredibly on edge. I decided against my better judgment to see what was inside of these boxes. My brief sift through the boxes still make me sick to my stomach. It didn't take long for me to realize. It was child pornography. One thing that still gets to me is that it was really neatly organized in folders and small boxes. These people were organized. I immediately recoiled, jumped up and ran over to Jeremy. I could hardly string a sentence together. I dragged him out, composed myself, and managed to explain what I saw. We jumped back into the truck and sped back to the house. The farm had no mobile phone reception, and we hadn't bought the satellite phone, so we had to get back to the landline to call the police. Once we called them, they still had to make it all the way to the farm from the nearest police station, which was in a town about a half hour from the town closest to the farm. We waited, talking frantically about what we had seen, till the cops arrived almost an hour later. They arrived with 2 4-wheel drives. We jumped in and led them back. This is where it got worse. By the time we got back, the container door was open. There was a fire raging inside. We had only 2 small extinguishers in the car, and these did very little. The fire department took an hour to get there, by which stage most of the damage was already done. An arson report by the federal police found almost no evidence of the computer equipment described, and only traces of paper and cardboard. This means that whoever ran it knew we were there and had time to come and remove most of it and get away. There were various ways to get off of the property, and the land mass was huge, so there was no real way to tail them. Since the police hadn't taken us all too seriously in the first instance, probably due to our poor explanation on the phone, aerial surveillance was also impossible by the time we had pieced it all together. I took a keen interest in following it up, but with no real evidence of who might be responsible, the investigation went cold. I've kept in contact with Jeremy, and the shipping container is still sitting there on the farm, as if it's too expensive to move. Thank you guys for watching and listening to the very end. Please be sure to like and subscribe for future content, and if you would like your story featured on an upcoming video, email it to my email in the description box below. And remember to stay sinful.